How Britain drained India's wealth. In the year 1700, India made up nearly 1/4 of the global economy. It was the heart of world trade, a prosperous land of gold, silk, and spices, exporting fine cotton textiles and jewelry to continents far away. India's major cities were radiant with craftsmanship and skill, and bustling with trade. Indian urban centers shone with artisanal mastery and prosperous commerce. Bengal alone was wealthier than all of Britain combined. But by 1940, when India gained independence, its share of the world economy had fallen to under 4%. This decline did not happen naturally. It was taken not only by war, but through ledgers, taxation, and trade regulations. For 2 centuries, the British Empire engineered one of the most elaborate colonial extraction systems in history. They did not simply rule India. They turned the entire country into an profit-making machine. They transformed a civilization that once exported luxury goods to Rome, Arabia, and China into a supplier of cheap raw materials for British factories. And they achieved this through a quiet revolution in the way financial records were kept. This is not a story about nationalism or revenge. It is a story told through numbers about how one of the world's wealthiest societies at the time became one of the poorest regions on Earth, not because of war, but due to a meticulously engineered financial design. To fully understand this story, we must return to the very beginning, long before the British flag flew over Indian skies, back in the early 1600s. India was ruled by the Mughal Empire, a vast and advanced civilization, with nearly 150 million people, making up almost 1/4 of the world's population. Under the Mughals, agriculture flourished, irrigation systems were advanced, and ports were constantly busy. Indian textiles were so famous that European merchants sailed for months just to bring back cotton fabrics, pepper, sandalwood, and silk. All these goods were exported through ports like Surat and Kolkata. India maintained a trade surplus with nearly every nation. Gold and silver constantly flowed into the subcontinent, not out, but across the ocean. A small island nation was rising with ambition, armed with force, and reorganizing its economy around an entirely new model: the Joint Stock Company. In the year 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted a royal charter to a group of London merchants to establish the English East India Company. At first, it wasn't a government, but over time it became a powerful entity, with shareholders, a board of directors, and soon afterwards, an entire private army. Initially, the company was just a small trader in a highly competitive market, where Portugal, the Netherlands, and France were already present. But while other nations sought cooperation, the British sought monopoly. Their secret weapon was not diplomacy or gunfire, but finance. They had capital raised through bonds, and insurance backed by Lloyd's of London, and a powerful credit network in London that allowed them to expand their trade operations on a scale never seen before in history. The company quickly realized that the real profit did not lie in trading goods, but in collecting taxes. In 1757, everything changed completely. The Battle of Plassey, a small clash in Bengal, became a turning point in world history. With fewer than 1,000 British soldiers and a small group of local allies, the East India Company defeated the Nawab of Bengal. But the greatest victory came afterward, when the company installed a puppet ruler and granted itself the right to collect all of Bengal's taxes. That decision marked the birth of the corporate colonial model. Within just 1 decade, the company siphoned tens of millions of pounds every year from Bengal. The outflow of wealth was so massive that it caused inflation, famine, and financial collapse across the region. London prospered brilliantly, while Kolkata was exhausted and starving. In the eyes of the British Parliament, those profits were staggering. East India Company dividends soared, stock prices exploded in London, and investors who had never set foot in Asia became wealthy thanks to taxes extracted from Indians. Yet those taxes were collected from farmers who could not afford to feed their families. The company had become something the world had never seen: a private empire with its own currencies, its own army, and even its own court system. In London, the company's leaders sat in luxurious meeting rooms, while in India, their agents oversaw forced labor, monopolized trade, and strangled local industries, all under the banner of free markets. This was not mere plunder. It was systematic wealth extraction. When a devastating famine struck Bengal in 1770, killing around 10 million people, even as corpses lay scattered along the roads, the company's revenues continued to rise. They kept collecting taxes and continued exporting grain. For investors in London, it was a profitable year. The idea of markets had completely replaced the idea of compassion. Meanwhile, British economists at home justified everything by calling it a civilizing mission. They claimed that India was backward and Britain was modernizing it by building railways, enacting laws, and spreading English education. But all those so-called reforms were designed purely for extraction. The railways were not built to connect Indians with one another, but to link cotton fields to export ports for shipment. Schools did not create a new middle class. They only trained clerks for the colonial machine of governance. The courts did not protect citizens' rights. They only tightened the spiral of debt. Even the railways, often praised as the empire's great gift, were designed to guarantee profits for the British. British investors were promised returns of 5% a year, paid with Indian tax money. Whether the railways were efficient or not, the profits still flowed to London, while the costs fell on Kolkata. This was the financial version of a vampire system, draining everything without leaving a trace. The extraction mechanism was so efficient that it had its own name, the drain of wealth. Indian scholar Dadabhai Naoroji, in his book published in 1901, titled Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, he described that phenomenon as India slowly bleeding, as its resources, labor and capital constantly flowed to Britain, without any benefit ever being returned. He estimated that by the end of the 19th century, India was losing hundreds of millions of pounds a year. That money became the source that funded the Industrial Revolution and Britain's imperial wars. And his analysis was completely accurate. During the period from 1760 to 1930, historians estimate that Britain drained from India an amount equivalent to $45 trillion in today's value, a figure even larger than the combined GDP of the United States and China today. Those calculations are truly staggering, but the real impact was not only economic, it was the suffering of human beings. For centuries, India had been a major exporter of luxury goods and an importer of precious metals, yet under British rule, the situation reversed completely. India began exporting raw cotton, opium, and grains, while importing manufactured goods from Britain. Artisans, weavers, and merchants, once the backbone of the global luxury economy, were wiped out entirely by colonial policies. British textiles flooded the Indian market at prices no local craftsman could ever compete with or hope to match. Towns once famous for weaving and cloth production, like Dhaka, slowly decayed and collapsed. By the mid-19th century, India, once the world leader in textile, had been reduced to supplying raw cotton for the mills of Manchester. This was globalization, 19th century style. India became the raw material base fueling Britain's industrial rise, and at the same time a tightly controlled market for British goods. Even though British officials proudly spoke of modernization, India's per capita income remained almost unchanged for nearly 2 centuries. Famines became more frequent. Wages declined sharply. Yet the British Empire grew richer than ever. This was no accident. It was a carefully calculated business model. Every empire in history collected tribute, but the British found a way to make tribute look like free trade. By the 19th century, the East India Company had been replaced by direct rule under the British Crown. After the rebellion of 1857, the colonial financial machinery remained intact. At this point, the British Empire no longer needed to conquer by force, because it possessed a greater power, binding contracts. India's revenues were used to pay for Britain's wars in Afghanistan, pensions for British civil servants, and even salaries for colonial officers in Africa. The cost of running the empire was shifted entirely onto the people being ruled, while for Britain, it was the most profitable deal in centuries. When the colonized end up becoming the financiers of the very power that conquered them. By the end of the 19th century, that system had evolved into a far more sophisticated model, a form of financial imperialism, so carefully disguised that it no longer appeared to be exploitation, but simply normal administrative work. The British government in India had by then perfected a mechanism called the home charge. These were annual payments that India had to send to Britain under the label of paying for services, including salaries of British officials working in India, interest on the loans granted by London to build railways and infrastructure, pensions for retired British civil servants, and even the cost of maintaining British troops stationed in India. In theory, these were considered administrative expenses, but in reality, they were a subtle accounting maneuver designed to extract wealth from India. Each year, enormous sums of money were drained into Britain without any value flowing. Back in return, no goods exchanged, no services provided. It was a one-way financial current, a colonial balance sheet pushing wealth northward, while leaving poverty behind. By the early 20th century, these transfers exceeded $100 million every year, equivalent to tens of billions in today's value. In total, economists estimate that over 2 centuries, the British Empire extracted wealth from India, equivalent to $45 trillion in today's terms, a figure so large it is hard to comprehend. Yet its traces remain everywhere. India's once prosperous economy of artisans and merchant guilds was replaced by a class of indebted peasants, buried in loans. Meanwhile, Britain's industrial cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool were built on profits from raw materials taken from India. The The textile mills of Lancashire burned through the nights because India's looms had fallen silent. To the British Parliament, this was progress. But for India, it was deindustrialization. And textiles were not the only industry destroyed. Shipbuilding, iron smelting, and carpentry also declined under British policy. India's forests were stripped to supply timber for railway sleepers. Farmers were forced to switch to export crops, like indigo and opium, for Britain's global trade, instead of ensuring food security for their own country. And when drought struck, the consequences were catastrophic. From 1870 to 1902, waves of famine swept across the subcontinent, killing more than 20 million people. Yet during those very years, India still exported millions of tons of grain to Britain. Grain that could have saved countless lives was instead shipped away, simply because export revenue was valued more than human lives. A British official named Sir Richard Temple even opposed famine relief, believing that doing so would break the laws of the market. The market had become the measure of morality. But perhaps the most subtle and terrifying part of this system was the way it used India's own money to sustain the empire. When Britain waged wars in Afghanistan, Burma, or Africa, most of the costs were paid using India's revenue. India was not just a colony, it was the central bank of the entire empire. Indian soldiers fought on every front from Sudan to Singapore, and their salaries were paid from the taxes of the people of India. Britain's infrastructure projects around the world were also built using India's capital. The empire ran on the Indian rupee, even when Indian villages lacked cash, to the point of starvation, and farmers barely survived day to day. British investors still earned profits, guaranteed by those infrastructure projects, paid for by India. The railway system, often praised as a gift Britain gave to India, was in fact built with British capital, under contracts that guaranteed a 5% annual return, with all risks pushed onto taxpayers. In India, if the railways failed to generate enough profit, Indians had to cover the shortfall. The risk was India's, but the rewards were Britain's. This was the colonial financial model, where profits were privatized and costs were socialized. Even after the East India Company was dissolved, the mindset remained. The London financial class realized they no longer needed to occupy new territories to profit. They just needed to control credit. The empire had found its final form. It was debt. After gaining independence in 1940, India inherited not only poverty, but also a system of dependency spanning generations. Centuries of extraction had destroyed local industries, devastated domestic capital, and left the country's literacy rate below 2%, accompanied by chronic famine. Yet the world India entered was not a free one. It was a globalized financial system, built on the very principles the British Empire once imposed: trade imbalances, one-way capital flows, and invisible extraction. Newly independent nations, still economically weak, quickly fell into the same familiar trap. They exported raw material, imported finished goods, and borrowed foreign currency just to stay afloat. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? It was the same structure that drained India for 2 centuries, just in its 20th century form. Today, that mechanism goes by another name. It is called debt dependence, or structural adjustment. The IMF and World Bank carry no guns and deploy no troops, but they use conditional loans, austerity programs, and trade rules that produce the same outcomes as before. Streams of wealth flow from the poor to the rich, disguised as policy. Every year, developing countries must transfer to richer economies over $200 billion in interest and repatriated profits, far surpassing the aid they receive. That direction of flow never reverses. It only becomes more digitized. The empire may have collapsed, but the ledgers continue to run as usual. This is the silent truth of global capitalism, a system built on the blueprint of an empire. It's the same logic of extraction, only more refined, quieter and harder to detect. When Britain industrialized, they did it with resources, labor, and revenue from India. Today, modern nations industrialize in different ways, but still rely on outsourced labor, foreign debt, and profits from offshore financial centers. Times may change, but the imbalance remains. This lesson is both obvious and deeply modern. Empires do not disappear, they evolve. They shift from land to ledgers, from gunpowder to contracts, from military conquest to regulatory control. And India's story is the clearest proof of that transformation. What Britain built in India was not just a colonial regime, but the prototype of the modern global economy. A place where value is siphoned upward quietly, through systems of credit, trade, and leasing. The plantation system was once considered the world's first free market experiment, but in reality, only one side was free. Even today, when discussing globalization, we often forget that it began as a network, designed to extract resources. The ships that once carried silk and spices, now carried financial banks that once served the empire now serve development programs. but the flow of profit still moves in the same direction as India endured. And that may be the most unexpected turning point in this story. Despite being plundered, impoverished, and divided for 2 centuries, this nation nationalized its industries, reformed its monetary system, and began reclaiming what had been taken, not through revenge, today, India, but through innovation, is one of the fastest-growing economies in the world. Yet historical wounds remain. The wealth gap between the global north and south still reflects divisions from centuries ago. Old trade routes have turned into flows of capital, raising questions every generation must face. When a system values extraction over value creation, can it ever truly be free? Because in the end, what the British Empire proved was not that empires would collapse, but that they know how to adapt. And what India proves is that even the most heavily exploited nations can rise again. It just takes time, while exploitation happens instantly. This is the ruthless arithmetic of all empires. The British did not conquer India. They conquered it with accountants. It's not that empires will collapse, but that they know how to adapt. And what India proves is that even the most exploited nations can rise again. It just takes time to recover, while exploitation happens instantly. This is the ruthless arithmetic of all empires. The British did not conquer India only with armies. They conquered it with accountants. The ledger they opened in 1757 has never been closed. It's only different in that it now carries new names and operates with more modern tools. A history that doesn't repeat itself. But the balance sheets always echo the familiar patterns. If this video has given you a new perspective, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss upcoming content. Your support is truly the motivation for me to continue creating more videos with higher quality. Thank you very much.